It is clear that Su Inviting, who was truly wealthy but died in despair, has been reborn. In her previous life, she swallowed her anger, but in the future, her hands were ruthless and her heart turned black. No one wants to suck on her blood and still feel fishy. Let's do it again, that day and last month, with a pearl on her crown and a dazzling light. Someone followed behind her, digging a pit for her while earnestly persuading her. Don't bother so much, can you see the crown on my head? You are the most gorgeous one above. Keywords of the novel. Guanshang Zhuhua no pop-ups, Guanshang Zhuhua TXT complete collection download, Guanshang Zhuhua latest chapter reading. Chapter 1. Wedge. Vampire. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1 Wedge. Vampire entering the cold winter, the prosperity of Tongzhou is no less than that of the capital, with servants coming to tidy up the courtyards or wealthy families bringing their families to Tongzhou hot spring villa to soak in soup for the winter. Among them, the people from the Su family were considered late. They reopened this long-neglected villa and briskly cleaned it up, bringing boxes and cages that filled a row of rooms. The movement in the east courtyard is so huge, while the west courtyard appears even more desolate. In such a cold and desolate winter, Su Invited sat in a bamboo wheelchair, silently pursing his lips and gazing at the sunset on the horizon. Her intimate maid, Yen Chao, hurriedly ran in from outside and saw her sitting in the corridor. She quickly ran over and said, "Why is the girl sitting here without even a blanket? These people are killing thousands of dollars." Su Invited but calmly raised his hand. As an abandoned son who had lost his usefulness, having a place to settle down was already a charity for the Su family. How could he expect more? She asked Yen Chao in a hoarse voice, "Has he come?" The Su family comes to Beeswang every year for winter, and Mrs. Su, who is also Su's biological mother, cannot bear the cold. Every winter, she comes to soak in hot springs to dispel the cold. Of course, Su Inviting has no feelings for the other members of the Su family. She hopes to see someone else. Yen Chao lowered her eyes and held Su Invite's hand with cold hands, saying in a low voice, "Miss, can I send you in first?" Hu Luopinjiang was bullied by a dog, and Su Invite actually has no temper anymore. Anyone who falls into the fate of going down to her mother's house will not have any temper. Su Wen understands the truth of the cold and desolate world very well. Because we are in a humble position, we have the most opportunity to see the truth of human relationships and relationships. Even her own parents, brothers and sisters can coldly watch her fall here and regard her as the shame of the family. They are afraid to avoid her. What can they ask others for? So Su Invited has always been a very obedient person. When you tell her that it's not possible or not, she never asks why and easily accepts it. But this time it's an exception. She held the hand of Yen Chao in the opposite direction and persistently said, "Where's Ollie?" Yen Chao looked puzzled and couldn't say a word. Just as she didn't know how to avoid it, the rarely stepped courtyard door made a dull sound again. The door was opened, and a dressed woman in her 30s was surrounded by a group of maids and servants. Yen Chao quickly blocked Su Inviting with a guarded expression. "But there's no need to block it, why block it?" That person had already been weighing on Su Wen's head, a lifelong insurmountable mountain. Her life or death was in the blink of an eye, and no matter where she was, Su Wen could always see her at a glance. How ironic. Su Invited a sigh in his heart, unable to explain what it felt like in his heart. This woman, who is the same age as her but shining brightly, is countless times younger than her. She is her sister and also her demon. Before she could speak, Su Xingxuan had already walked up to her in the blink of an eye, squatting down with a sincere expression. Her beautiful eyes were slightly raised, revealing a smile. "Sister, are you waiting for Ollie?" Su Invited felt a slightly sweet and fishy taste surging up in his throat. She couldn't bear to see Su Xingxuan's condescending generosity, but in fact, she didn't have any capital that she couldn't bear. After a pause, Zhu Xin remained unmoved and pouted slightly, still as charming as a girl. She spoke in a sweet tone, "Sister, don't wait. Ali won't come today. Today, Marquis Chongping is getting married, and Ali has to be busy managing the guests. She has already been taken back by Marquis Chongping." Swallowgrass's shoulders trembled slightly, trembling like leaves in the autumn wind. She knew that this sentence was like a dagger piercing into Su Invite's heart, sealing her throat at the sight of blood. Chongping Marquis Chengdingen was the former husband of Su Invite. Not long ago, he retired from Su Invite and insisted on marrying his old childhood sweetheart, making Su Invite a joke throughout the capital. Chengli is a 13-year-old child who was raised by Su Invite. He originally followed Su Invite back to the Su family, but now he has returned to the Cheng family to take care of Chengdingen's wedding and receive guests. This was like sprinkling another handful of salt on Su Invite's already bruised wound, and it was also the last straw that crushed Su Invite. The fishy sweetness in Su's throat couldn't be suppressed, and he bent down and suddenly vomited a mouthful of blood. Yen Chao let out a scream of fear and quickly rushed over to take a handkerchief to wipe Su Invite's face. Tears had already welled up in her eyes. Su Invite had been stuck in her heart since she was in the Cheng family, with damaged lung veins and no ability to breathe. Every time she vomited blood, it intensified and destroyed her life. Yen Chao was frightened and cried bitterly. Su invited her to hold her hand, his gaze lowered, and he stopped on Su Xingxuan's interested face. She knew that Su Xingxuan came today to wait for this moment. However, Su Xingxuan felt disappointed. What she hated the most was Su Sun's lifeless and knowing face. She sighed naively like a little girl, "Sister, don't be angry." If sister had known today, would she have come back to the Su family? She naively and innocently looked at Su Invite, seeming somewhat aggrieved. "When I was 9 years old at Su's parents, I suddenly realized that I was not my mother's biological daughter, but Jie. Does Jie know how sad I am?" Su Inviting couldn't see how upset Su Xingxuan was. She grew up in the Jin region from a young age. Her father was an ordinary Jin merchant who lived a life that was more than enough. When she reached the age of 9, someone suddenly came to her family, saying that she was not the daughter of the Shen family, but the biological daughter of Yongdingbo, and they wanted to take her home. Her life underwent earth-shattering changes overnight. At that time, Su Xingxuan was not the only one who was afraid. She is as far away as her hometown, like a startled magpie with no branches to rely on, unsure of where the long road ahead lies. Besides, she hasn't been able to return to Yongding uncle's mansion immediately. The Su family first sent her to the He family in Taiyuan, also located in Shandong. Su Sun later found out that it was the ancestral home of her birth mother, the He family, and also her maternal grandmother. The Su family disliked her growing up in a merchant's home, fearing that she would be exposed to the copper smell of the merchant's house. They first placed her in the He family. She closed her eyes slightly. Later, she returned to the capital at the age of 12. At that time, she was filled with joy and anticipation, completely cut off from her adoptive father's family, and was placed in foster care with her maternal grandparents. Her mind was particularly sensitive and uneasy, and she both hoped for and relied on her biological parents. She was greeted only by a few unfamiliar women. She stayed in the bustling yet lonely Su family for 4 days without seeing her father, mother, or any of her relatives. Those days were like years for her, and after a few years, she found herself in a completely new environment. She was completely overwhelmed by anxiety and panic, as if she was on an island that was about to be submerged at any moment. Later, she found out that the people of the Su family did not intentionally treat her coldly, it was just that there was someone who was much more important than her. On the day she returned home, the Su family took Su Xingxuan to Chongping Marquis' mansion to apologize. The Crown Prince of Chongping Marquis' mansion spoke rudely to Su Xingxuan, and Su invited his own brother Suan to fight with the Crown Prince Chengdingen over her. He accidentally pushed someone into the lake, but the crown prince couldn't water. After drowning, he fell into a coma for 4 or 5 days, and even the imperial physician said he could only do his best to obey fate. After such an incident, the people of the Su family poured out in droves to solve it. Why bother with her? This lawsuit has been ongoing for a long time, until it reaches the front of the court. The Qing family refuses to let go and demands an explanation from the Su family. After much thought, Suan suggested that Su invite her to marry into the Qing family to congratulate Qing Dingyan. At that time, they had not even met Su invite, and they didn't know whether Su invite was round or flat, but this matter was so strange and decided without the involvement of the parties involved. I don't know how the Su family negotiated, but the Qing family was also persuaded. At the age of 12, Su invited him to be engaged to the Su family less than a month after returning. She was like a cloth, used by the Su family to easily block the dirty area. Sometimes Su invites to wonder if the Su family really held the wrong child back then. Otherwise, why is she clearly the biological one, yet she can't get anything? Whether it's the favor of parents and siblings, a complete family, or even a reasonable marriage. She could only compromise everywhere, living like a shadow of Su Xingxuan. All the mistakes made by Su Xingxuan must be compensated by her. So, Su Xingxuan surprisingly felt aggrieved. If all this is grievance, what is her ridiculous and absurd life? She asked herself, I have never done anything bad in my life, why should I be played with by fate like this? Do you disagree? Su Xingxuan finally showed some interest in her eyes clear and innocent like a child. Sister, you're just a bit of a human like you are now. Look at you, you're so boring, like a clay statue of a bodhisattva. No wonder everyone doesn't like you. I don't know who shouted outside, but Su Xingxuan ignored Su's invitation no longer, as if she had thrown away a toy she had grown tired of. Without hesitation, she happily responded and ran out like a little deer. Yancao's eyes lit up with anger as he crouched down and grabbed Su Invite's hand. He hurriedly comforted her and said, Young master, you may not be so immature. Don't worry, I'll go out and inquire. Su An's voice came from outside. What are you doing to see her? She's crazy, only you always have a good mind for her. A tone of disgust like this Swallowgrass's fingers were pinched with force, causing the joints to turn white. How could these people be so shameless? They sucked on the blood of their own girl, got rid of trouble and got everything they wanted, but in the end, they turned around and despised her for losing face. Is there still justice in this world? Su invited, but his expression was relieved. From this moment on, all her feelings towards both Chengli and the Su family disappeared. Everything she has done over the years has turned out to be just moving herself. She will never be swayed by their emotions again. The snow had already begun to drift down the corridor, and she watched as the chaos covered up all the mud. She lowered her eyes and felt a little tired. She's living too tired. Since even Chengli no longer needs her, she doesn't have to think about anyone anymore. Finally, she can be liberated. She remembered a sentence that Song Hengchang said when she was young. He said that if there is an afterlife, he should never be a child of the Song family again. At this moment, life was at its end, and Su invited thought of Song Heng in his heart, suddenly feeling numb in his hands and feet. If Song Heng is still alive, if there is still an afterlife, the new book has just opened, and I am extremely nervous. I hope everyone will like it. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Freshmen. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. Freshman. The drum has been pounded 3 times, but the He family is still brightly lit up and down. In the dark, servants carrying lanterns keep coming and going, and the He family, which has always been regulated and heavy, is lively like celebrating the Chinese New Year. Amidst the hustle and bustle, Grandma He lightly yawned and quickly reached out to cover the corner of her mouth, suppressing her impatience. What's wrong with this? Are you sick again? The night maid went out and came back with reliable news. Yes, I heard that Miss Biao is having a nightmare again, with a high fever that doesn't subside. Now my wife is in a hurry to have someone go out to find a doctor. Grandma he frowned. Since ancient times, a cousin has been the most troublesome. Living at home, it is easy to have some troubles with her cousin. However, this cousin in their family is different from other cousins. She has lived at home for so many years and has always been honest. She is an honest person who can avoid causing trouble to others. After raising her for so many years, a few days ago there was finally a letter from the capital. My sister-in-law and the uncle over there finally remembered this biological daughter whose bag had been dropped and wanted to take her home. Grandma he thought it would be like this from now on. Who knew that she had already packed her bags and was destined to be sent to the capital by the second master. This young cousin, who had never been in trouble and had not even suffered from illness a few times, suddenly fell ill. This disease lasted for over 2 months, dragging from late summer to late autumn, with signs of worsening. Mrs. He felt sorry for her granddaughter and naturally refused to let her go to Beijing in a sickly state. Recently, she has been constantly seeking medical treatment, but there has been no progress at all. After all this trouble, the illness seems to have worsened. Grandma he sighed and reached out to tidy up her already changed clothes. She stood up and said, "Let's go and take a look. I won't neglect my mother-in-law's heart and soul." There was resentment in these words. The maid Bauhinia dared not say anything, but Wang, the wet nurse of Grandma Hier who had just put out the lantern and came in, smiled and naturally stepped forward to take over Bauhinia's work. She helped Grandma Hier out of the threshold and said, "Don't say that. How could you argue with a child?" Wang grew up serving his second grandmother Wang from a young age, and her relationship was extraordinary. After saying this, she finally talked about the main matter. The capital is urging us, saying that we have asked high-level officials before the Chinese New Year, and we must take Miss Biao to the capital. A Miss Biao, who is usually honest, also respects you. Don't play with your childish temper, it will only make your wife unhappy. An obedient child is always likable everywhere, especially when Zhu Xin has such a bizarre experience. He was born with the wrong child and spent several years in exile before being picked up. Perhaps due to growing up in a merchant's home, Su invited a very knowledgeable person to observe her words and expressions, never making things difficult for others. When she met people, she would smile a little. To be fair, after spending so many years together, not only did Mrs. He value her, but she and her sister-in-law, who were both uncles, did indeed have some sincerity towards her. Besides, everyone is about to leave. If she still makes some gossip in the end to make people think that her aunt is not kind, it will not only offend her mother-in-law and husband, but also offend the difficult sister-in-law and the Su family. It is really not worth it. Therefore, when Grandma He arrived at Mrs. He's Fanghua garden, her emotions were particularly sincere and enthusiastic. "Mom, what's wrong with this illness? I'm afraid it's not a problem to be sick all this time." Mrs. He's face is also not good looking, and wrinkles have appeared on her well-maintained face. The outside sky was dark and heavy, like a lion in the jungle with its bloodthirsty mouth open, ready to devour everything at any time. In the inner room came suppressed and mournful cries. After being sick for a long time, Su Yaoyao's cries were like a little kitten being choked by someone, weak and suppressed, as if they were about to disappear with the wind at any time. Thunder exploded, and time seemed to tear open a crack. In a daze, Mrs. He seemed to return to that miserable rainy night many years ago. It was also at that time that she lost her husband and her daughter was forced to give birth to a child in a dilapidated temple. Mrs. He could hardly control her emotions. Fortunately, at this moment, Grandma He came out of the inner room and breathed a sigh of relief. When she saw Grandma He also coming, she nodded first and then hurriedly said to Mrs. He, "Mom, the fever has subsided, but she's still in chaos. If you ask her, she won't say anything." Maybe she's been sick for a long time, so let her sleep for a night and maybe she'll be fine. Mrs. He exhaled wearily, and the jujube tree outside the window was particularly terrifying in the night. It swayed left and right when the wind blew, and its teeth and claws were wide open, making people feel restless and restless. She withdrew her gaze and pointed her finger on the table, attracting the two daughter-in-law to look over together before slowly saying, "Do the good deed to the end, send the Buddha to the west." It's only been a few days, everyone is hoping for a good start and a good end. Thank you for your trouble. Since she had an accident 10 years ago, her body has developed palpitations and she no longer serves as the family director. The family's feedbacks are all managed by her eldest daughter-in-law, who occasionally helps out. Granny He and Granny He's eyebrows twitched and they exchanged a glance, both quickly agreeing. Mrs. He waved her hand, as the night was getting dark. She heard that Sue invited had already gone to bed, so she only looked at her through the tent once. The girl in the tent has a bright and beautiful color. Even if she is sick, her body is wrapped in a layer of rain and mist from Jiangnan, so beautiful that it is hard to open her eyes. She looked quietly for a while, then raised an eyebrow at the swallowgrass serving beside her and said, "Serve well. If the girl wakes up tomorrow and wants to eat anything, just tell Huang Mama." A lamp was like a bean, and Sue invited him, who should have fallen asleep, to open his eyes again. The window was tightly closed, and the hanging curtain was sky blue. The painting screen that she loved the most when she was a girl now stands not far away. She remembered she was dead, but when she opened her eyes, she was not in the underworld, but instead returned to the He family where she resided. At first, she thought it was because she had too much resentment, so God asked her to come back and take a look. But as time passed, she was still here, even her body gradually becoming agile from its initial stiffness. This confirmed one thing for her. She should have come back to life, living in her teenage body again. The girl woke up. The swallowgrass heard the rustle inside, rolled the curtain quickly, looked at her with a smile, "Are you hungry? There is still congee warm outside, can I bring it to you?" The hazy mist since rebirth was completely lifted, and everything from the previous life slowly faded away like a painting. Sue invited to look into Yensao's eyes, and the girl's gaze was clear, with a gentle smile on her face. Such a good girl, this girl who has been with her since she came to the He family, was forced to self-medicate in her previous life and stay with her for a lifetime without getting married. She died so destitute, how could the people of the Su family treat her girl well? With the temperament of Yenchao, I'm afraid I'll still follow her along, girl. Seeing that she didn't react, Yenchao waved her hand in front of her and couldn't help but sigh. Having been with her for many years, she had some knowledge of Sue's feelings. No matter how good the He family was, it was just an outsider. The Su family was only now in a hurry to take her back to recognize her ancestors. Speaking of it, there was not much sincerity, nor was there much concern for their daughter. But these words were not what a maid like her should say. After thinking about it, Yenchao asked her, "Miss, are you afraid to go back?" Su invited to blink his eyes and recover from the complex thoughts. Life is indeed a precious thing. Revive at once, and see clearly what you couldn't see before. What you couldn't bear to see before is now a joke. In the past, worrying about gains and losses was because of caring. But after dying once, she was already able to give up on everyone in the Su family's third house. Are you afraid to go back? No, she needs to go back. She doesn't like the Su family, but when it comes to returning it to her, the Su family can't be stingy at all. She certainly needs to go back, and she also needs to go back in the wind and scenery. Since following the rules and taking whatever they want still cannot satisfy them, she simply doesn't want them to be so satisfied. The window was gently tapped by someone, and the voice of the steward saying "Mama" rang outside. It's getting late. Please serve the girl and go to bed earlier. Don't trouble the girl. This is the mother sent by the Su family in the capital. She has always been meticulous and difficult to get close to. Yan Chao quickly agreed and walked over to close the window again. Moonlight shone through the gap, shining on Su Wen's face and hair, pouring onto the ground. She turned her head and saw Su Wen's eyes, cold and cruel like the moonlight in this place. But when she wanted to take a closer look, Su Invited had already turned around and lay down, as if nothing had happened. She scratched her head and lay down lightly on the pedal, feeling a myriad of thoughts for a moment. After taking a nap, it was already dawn. Swallow Grass whispered to Su Invite a few words, heard her agree, and then rang the bell by the window. The maids who had been waiting outside were carrying water, and those who were holding pots rushed in for a while. Sang Mama fell last. After entering, she first looked at Su Invite and saw that although her face was pale and her body was thin and weak, her spirit had improved significantly compared to before. She nodded lightly and said, in theory, the girl has just recovered from her serious illness. She should have let you rest for a while, but today is a big day. If the girl still can't get out of bed, it's okay. Since she's fine, she should go and greet the elders. The second aunt of the He family, also known as the second aunt invited by Su, returned today and had already submitted a post. Su Invited should have gone to pay her respects. She glanced at Grandma Sang, her face unchanged, but her eyes were cold. Sang Mama was a housekeeper sent by the Su family to manage all the affairs in her room. She was also the most direct contact between the Su family and her. In the past, in order to have a good impression in front of Sang Mama, Su invited her to be almost obedient. Even Pearl, the daughter of Granny Sang, became a big maid by her side, with a head and face, ranking ahead of the Yan Chao and others. This mother-daughter pair. Pearl had already appeared in front of Su Invite with a smile, holding a handkerchief to wipe Su Invite's face and saying, "Miss, hurry up. We came in from outside, and I heard that Grandma's frame has already reached the alley. It's not good if you're late." As soon as they arrived, Yan Chao and the others were pushed to the back. Su invited them to glance at them without saying anything, then nodded and left the door. Mrs. He has been living in seclusion since she was widowed. She usually doesn't even leave the courtyard door when she has nothing to do, so she has set up a small Buddhist temple in her own room and can't come out easily. However, there is a happy event today, so her courtyard is rarely lively. Just as she arrived at the entrance of Tian Hospital, Chun Tao, who was beside Mrs. He, greeted her and smiled, giving her a glance. Amitabha Buddha, Miss Biao is quite well. Please come in quickly. Mrs. He was just thinking about it and said there was no need to work, miss, to avoid any further symptoms. Saying so, but already leading her in. Do we have to rely on others? Since we can still receive the favor of our elders, we should be even more careful in order to walk for a longer time. Su invited quietly into the door, and only then did he hear a crisp voice ring. So, then it's not possible to smoothly enter Beijing. She hesitated for a moment before bypassing the Boga frame and approached to greet Mrs. He, who was in charge. Everyone in the room fell silent. As we all know, Miss Biao grew up in a merchant's house. Because of this, she was afraid of being ridiculed and worked hard to learn etiquette. Perhaps it was also because she exerted too much force that she lost her natural sense, and it always felt like something was missing. This time, she came in and walked a short distance, which was pleasing to the eye. This change Mrs. He had already called out to her and beckoned with some heartache, calling her to her side. It's not that you've told the people around you, so there's no need for you to come over. Your aunt will be staying at home for a while, they are all from her own family. When will it be different to see them? At the beginning of her recovery from a serious illness, Su Invited's face was not very attractive, but what was rare was that she was born too well. Even though her foggy eyes were against two black circles, they only added a touch of timidity to her, but they looked even more beautiful. Super Fat Chapter, Passing by the Troubles, Praising Your Own Field, Seeking Collection and Recommendation, Bowing Modesty, End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Guidance. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Guidance. She was stunned for a moment before turning her head to Mrs. He and saying, "You're really good. Looking. With such a beautiful appearance, I don't know what kind of bright future you'll have in the future. Do you have a good appearance?" Zhu Xin has long been indifferent to her appearance. Her good looks have not brought her any benefits, but instead she always gets pointed at. Perhaps because she was born weak from the beginning of her marriage, people always make a secret comment about her, saying that she is too seductive and not suitable for being a big lady. Mrs. He smiled softly and said, "This little girl has always looked very pleasing." Before finishing a sentence, Grandma He came in from outside without waiting for a report. She glanced at Zhu Xin and instinctively coughed, saying to Mrs. He, "Mom." Zhu Xin knew it must be something related to him, so he lowered his eyes and glanced at his aunt next to him, feeling a sense of accomplishment in his heart. Around this time in my previous life, my second aunt came back to visit my family, but another group of guests also came uninvited. The Shen family, who had been raising Su for 9 years, came to visit. The Shen family is just a merchant, and the Bo mansion is far away in the capital and a prestigious family, which is beyond their reach. Over the years, they have also gone to the capital to find their own daughter, but they have repeatedly encountered obstacles and cannot even enter the door of the Bo mansion. Later, they finally found out about Su Invite's whereabouts and came to the He family, hoping to meet him. This is not a good thing for Su Invite. Seeing her, not to mention what the Su family, who had always been indifferent to her, would think, even the people of the He family would think that she was indeed raised by a merchant and couldn't understand. It's hard to see that being criticized again is due to her cold and thin nature. Even her adoptive parents who have been raising her for over a decade can be turned away. Su Xingxuan, who was also from an awkward background, was well protected. A wealthy family built a wall around her, tightly protecting her from the wind. Mrs. He glanced at Su Sun and said, "Your aunt has come all the way. Let's take care of her at night. You should go back and rest first." Su invited them to stand up obediently, without asking too many questions, and bowed to them without making any mistakes. As she went out, she vaguely heard Aunt He exclaim, "Where is it like being raised by a merchant's family? Every move looks grand, and I'm confused." She curled her lips and smiled, then turned the corridor back to her yard. Before entering, she saw Grandma Sang anxiously welcoming her with pearls. Pearls skillfully pushed open the swallow grass and stuffed a handmade stove for Su Inviting, while lowering her voice in a very subtle way, saying to her, "Miss, do you know that your parents are here?" It is taboo to say that her adoptive parents are her parents, and even the people of the He family look down on merchants like the Shen family, hoping that she will forget about them. However, Pearl dared to say this, and the reason behind it was simply because she was the first person around Su Inviting. Su invited to take a glance at her, then paused and finally entered the room. Yan Chao shouted anxiously to the girl, "You." Before she could finish her sentence, Pearl had already followed Su into the room. Grandma Sang turned around to look at her and saw a little girl carrying hot water, so she asked Yan Chao to hold a basin. Sang Mama is a steward and comes from the capital city. She is in charge of all the affairs of this room, and even Su Invite obeys her every word and shows great respect. Yan Chao couldn't afford to offend her, so she pursed her lips and had to take the basin. She was absent-minded about what Sang Mama and the others wanted to do. Listening to Pearl's tone, she actually wanted to encourage Su Invite to meet the Shin couple. "So what should we do?" She thought of this and suddenly felt a sharp pain in her palm. She let out a sigh and instinctively wanted to let go. "Miss, you've taken care of it." Sang Mama looked at her coldly with a cold gaze. "You're a first-class girl next to Miss, can't you handle such a task well? Usually, you should pay more attention to your tasks. You always turn a deaf ear and don't do serious tasks, but pay attention to other things." Yan Chao suddenly dared not speak again, feeling a chill in her heart. She endured the excruciating pain and stood in the corridor holding a basin, feeling that Su Invite's situation was also in such dire straits for a moment. But she was just the girl invited by the He family to Su. Although Su was usually very kind to her, she didn't trust Pearl and the others as much. She watched Sang Mama enter the room and couldn't help but feel scared. As Sang Mama entered the room, she heard Su Invite's voice calmly ask, "So what? They want to see me privately." Pearl grabbed a handful of lily incense and put it into the incense burner. She closed the lid before quickly turning around, seeming somewhat embarrassed. "Yes, I heard I begged at the gatekeeper for a month or so, and I heard you were sick. I even went to the temple to offer you incense and kowtow." She sighed and looked very hesitant and uneasy. "Miss, theoretically we shouldn't have told you, but they are also quite pitiful. They used to go to the capital every year, but they failed every year." Knowing not to do it, Su invited a mocking smile in his heart. "Even if Pearl doesn't understand, doesn't Grandma Sang also understand? It's just that the mother and daughter teamed up to play and show her," she exclaimed, seemingly hesitant, before finally saying, "Can we go out?" Grandma Sang scolded Pearl with a stern face. Seeing Pearl regretfully retreat to the side, she helped Su Invite roll up the curtain and put the fan screen on the table aside. She said, "Miss, don't listen to her nonsense. This girl's ears are soft and her heart is also soft." When she heard someone cry a few words, she knew something had happened at home now, so she couldn't hold back. "But this matter is not something you should intervene in. TSK, these mother and daughter play the role of a soft-hearted little girl and a loyal old lady, which is really better than the acting skills of the actors on stage." She hasn't said anything yet. These two of them have already explained the situation of the Shin family's couple to each other. Yes, she was actually raised by the Shin family. To be honest, during those 9 years, the Shin family treated her well, not without affection. Anyone who is a normal person and hears that they have no way to appeal will never remain indifferent. In her previous life, she was unable to remain indifferent. Thinking of this, she lowered her eyelids to cover her emotions, but asked anxiously on her face, "What? Mama, who did you say had an accident at home? What's wrong with them? I have been raised by a merchant for 9 years, and even though I have learned the rules and etiquette again at the He family, my perspective and overall perspective cannot catch up with the one in the capital." Looking at the hurried and panicked appearance, Grandma Sang looked disdainful in her heart, but with a pitiful and hesitant expression on her face. She sighed and shook her head. "Miss, don't inquire about this anymore. You have already returned to your grandfather's house, and our family has handed it over to them clearly. We don't owe them anything. Even if there is something wrong, it's not normal for them to ask for your help. If you intervene rashly, I'm afraid everyone will be unhappy." Sometimes Su Sun feels that she was not unjustly defeated in her previous life. Having Sang Mama by her side can make you jump out of the trap and make you feel like you have taken advantage of someone. You don't even know how you died. If you can hold on until the capital marries Qing Dingyan, it's probably thanks to Su Xingxuan's unwillingness to marry. She pursed her lips and choked up as Grandma Sang had anticipated, saying, "How can this be done? After all, they raised my grandmother. Can you help me?" Pearl's mouth couldn't help but curl up, mocking in her heart that she had never seen the world before. After being sick for a while, she didn't see any improvement, but instead became even more confused. When encountering such a situation, knowing that one cannot do it or ask their elders, one should seek a servant. I don't think if I were to be discovered, it would be even more of an outsider. She glanced at Grandma Sang. Grandma Sang had already frowned and said, "Miss, you're not right. If the in-laws and their wives find out, they might not be happy in their hearts. Look, she has already analyzed the consequences with this girl, but she didn't deceive her." Su Qin pursed her lips, her pale face conflicted and struggling. After a while, she took off a bracelet that had been worn on her wrist and stuffed it into Sang Mama's hand. "Mama, please, I won't let my grandmother and uncles know. As long as I can sneak a glance at them and ask what happened, she said. Sang Mama's gaze stiffened as she looked at Su Invite with a hint of exploration. The bracelet on Su Invite's wrist was prepared by the Su family when she arrived, and it had been carried by Mrs. Su all along. After hearing about this matter, Su invited this precious bracelet very much, wearing it every day and almost unwilling to leave. But now, Su Invite casually gave out this bracelet. Is she sick and foolish? Or are the people of the Shen family really so important to her that they make her even refuse the token given by her biological mother? Su invited his body to shake violently, as if he was not even aware of Sang Mama's scrutiny. He anxiously said, "Mama, just go take care of it. If that's not enough, I have other things here." Grandma Sang felt relieved in her heart. After spending so much time with Su Invite, she boasted that she had already figured out Su Invite's personality. This is a person who doesn't have too many thoughts, or rather, is very good at suppressing their own thoughts. He doesn't have much temper or hobbies, and his whole person is as indifferent as a shadow, which is easily overlooked. Such a little girl should indeed have no independent opinions, and she couldn't imagine too many things and too many consequences. Grandma Sang estimated in her heart and couldn't help but shake her head. I don't even know if I should put so much effort into calculating her. You know, with her temperament, what can I do when I return to the capital and arrive at my uncle's mansion? So dull and dull, the third wife wouldn't like it. However, since there were orders from above, she naturally had to do a good job here. She reluctantly refused a few times before reluctantly taking on the bracelet and sighed deeply. Okay, since the girl insists on doing so, as servants, we can only help you. It's just that this matter is not easy to let people know at the end. You still need to wait a moment. I'll think of a way for you to go out of the mansion and meet them, so that you can ask yourself clearly. Is it feasible? If my grandmother and I know, Su asked with a mixture of surprise and joy on his face, and then he hesitated and asked with some fear, so girls should be cautious. Sang Mama shook her head, the less people know about this matter, the better. We are sent from the capital to follow the girl, and honor and disgrace are one with the girl. If the girl doesn't insist on seeing us, we cannot agree to it. We are afraid that you will make mistakes. Su Sun felt a little embarrassed and lowered his head anxiously, fidgeting with his clothes. His voice was as low as a mosquito and fly, saying, "Excuse me for bothering you, Mammy. I'll see them this time. After seeing each other, I won't be back and forth anymore. It's not the next time either." After seeing this one, their task was almost completed. Grandma sang and nodded with a smile and looked at Su Invite with satisfaction in her eyes. Another chapter on overweight has arrived. I went to the hospital for a check-up this morning, so I didn't have time to come back and post an article. I will continue to ask for a collection and recommended tickets. I love everyone so much. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Confusion. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Confusion. Sang Mama walked out with Pearls and saw Yanchao standing in the corridor still holding a water basin. She nodded coldly at her and walked straight over her down the stairs. Pearl followed behind her with an uncontrollable leap of joy. "Mother, are you going out of the mansion to arrange it?" "I'll go out with you too. It's been a long time since I left." "You don't need to be on duty." Sang Mama gave her a cold glance and remained unmoved. "I sent you here to be on duty. Look at the other three who are diligent and cautious, and then look at yourself. I've told you before that even if you look down on her, you should pretend to be there and not show it. You're better, for fear that others won't notice." Sang Mama's tone was not good, but Pearl was not afraid. She leaned forward and hugged her arm affectionately, smiling and saying, "Who knew she was so weak?" Just a few words made her so scared that she fell ill like this. If she really went home, tsk. With just this little skill, it's not enough to take 3 moves in front of Miss San. She pursed her lips and sighed again, "Mother, if you go back, you need to find a way for me to go back to Miss San's place to serve you. That's really a promising place. Although Su Xingxuan is not the biological child of the third wife, who wouldn't know that she has been the darling of the third master since childhood. Not only does the third master like her, but even the second young master looks at her with no difference in eyes, otherwise they wouldn't have come here. Only by following such a master can one have a bright future. Even if one goes back to the capital with Su Invite, it would be the fate of sitting on a cold bench for a lifetime. Sang Mama glanced at her, still expressionless, but her tone softened. Virtue. If you want to serve third miss, please take care of your mouth first. Do you know the truth that misfortune comes from your mouth? Su invited them to stand by the window, looking at their backs. He lowered his head to cover the coldness in his eyes and slowly sneered. At this moment, Yan Chao brought in a basin and saw her standing in front of the window. She hurriedly came over to close the window for her, but her palm couldn't bend, so she clenched her fist and took the window down. Miss, it's just better. Don't stand in the wind, be careful if you catch a cold, she said. Su Sun keenly noticed that her movements were inconvenient and frowned. What's wrong with your hand? Yan Chao quickly withdrew his hand from behind and said, it's nothing. I didn't do things carefully and didn't pay attention to the hot water in the basin. Su Qin pursed his lips and looked at her, knowing that things were not so simple. A few days ago, she was sick and personally served the night shift. It was always Yan Chao and the others, but Pearl pretended not to come because she was sick. This time, she came and naturally wanted to give Yan Chao and the others a boost. With a mother who worked as a housekeeper, Pearl always felt superior. Did you not pay attention, or was someone embarrassed? Su Invited looked at her red hands like Mantu, and said in a deep voice. I was ill, but I saw a lot of things that could not be seen before. I can tell who is sincere and who is false. Mississippi. Yan Chao blinked and couldn't believe what she had heard for a moment. After Su invited her to the He family, she was given Su invitation by Mrs. He and knew Su's thoughts very well. Due to his anxiety about the future, Su invited the people sent by Mrs. Su to take seriously, such as Grandma Sang and the Pearl mother and daughter, so that they could truly be the masters of this courtyard. Because of this, Sang Mama dared to give orders to them, and Pearl was superior and consciously looked down upon them. They all knew what was on Su's mind, so even if they saw something was wrong, they dared not speak in front of Su, fearing that they would not be able to file a complaint and be labeled as talkative and ill-intentioned. But now what does Su Invite say? She said she was sick once, do you understand? But how can a person become clear in their ears and eyes overnight? Once upon a time, Su invited herself to immerse herself in the rules and etiquette, wishing to wrap herself up with these things and place her under the chastity plaque. Nothing else could enter her heart. This time, she was just sick, but it seems that there is indeed something different. Yan Chao thought and suddenly let out a cry in her heart, as if she had been enlightened. Yes, it's the wrong look in the eyes. Su Xin's gaze at people now is completely different from before. Even if Su Xin used to be rigid and uninteresting, she was still a normal girl. How could her gaze be like this, as if she had seen through everything and wanted to see into your heart? She remembered the look in Su's eyes when Grandma Sang knocked on the door last night, and it turned out that it was not her own illusion. Girl, she murmured, looking at Su Invite in confusion. In this world, only oneself can be reliable. Su Zhen seemed to be answering her question. Parents who have never been together before don't have much affection, let alone being servants of intermediaries. Besides, it's unclear whose people they are. Upon hearing these words, I truly understood everything. Yan Chao was first surprised and then pleased, and couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. She was named by Mrs. He to Su Invite, and in the future, when Su Invite comes to Beijing, she will definitely follow him. If Su Invite still listens to his beliefs and makes mistakes, what good fruits can these servants who follow him have? The closer she got to returning to the capital, the more anxious she felt in her heart. The Su family had not prepared anything except for a sang mama and a pearl, and Su Invite was obedient to them, not a clear-minded person. However, if sang mama and the others were not well-intentioned, Su Invite back to the Su family would be like a lamb in a tiger's mouth. But now Su Sun had figured it out. Yen Chao looked at Su Sun in shock, left and right, and the girl was still the same. But how could she suddenly figure it out? Su Invited, unprepared to explain to her, stood up with the book in his hand on the table and instructed her, "Change your clothes, let's go to Madam's place." She is usually very discerning. Apart from going to pay respects, unless Mrs. He has something to do, she will never go back when there are guests. This is unprecedented like today. Yen Xiao's heart became increasingly confused, and she touched Su Wengjing's clear gaze without any reason to calm down. It's just that if the girl wants to go, let's go. Mrs. He was listening to Aunt He talk about things in the capital and said, after all, this marriage will not fall on Yao Yao. Although I can see now that Yao Yao is not as shameless as my younger sister expected, how can he compare with the Rui who has been carefully nurtured by the uncle's mansion for so many years? Rui, everything goes according to one's wishes. Just listening to this nickname, one can know how the Bo family cherished this daughter in the first decade or so. Mrs. He pursed her lips and stretched the corners of her mouth into a line. She is also virtuous and virtuous. For her husband and son, her biological daughter can be left behind. The sarcasm in the words is not concealed. And he lowered her eyes and let out a slight sigh. Come on, update continue to seek favorites and recommendations, end of this chapter. Chapter 5. Diao Nu. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Diao Nu, no wonder she has been raising her for so many years, and Rui is also an extremely painful person. After all these years, having a cat, a dog has become emotional. And he frowned slightly and said, "Oh, it's just her own flesh and blood. Even if it's not as good as Rui after going back, it's much stronger than waiting for someone in the Shen family. Sometimes, people have to accept their fate." The noble daughter of Bo Mansion was wrongly held because of that incident. Although it was not her fault, who could have a way to deal with fate? Mrs. He is really uncomfortable in her heart. As Aunt He said, what is raised around her is different. She has raised Su Wen for so many years, and Su Wen is well-behaved and sensible. Her feelings for Su Wen are much stronger than those of Su Xingxuan. Just as she was thinking about it, Huang Mama couldn't hide her surprise and came in, saying that Su invited her back. Mrs. He was taken aback. She also knew that Su Invited was cautious and sensible. Even though she knew there were guests in her room, Grandma He had reported back and forth, but still went back and forth, which was somewhat unusual. Is there any discomfort in the body? She was a bit worried and directly let someone in, but when she saw Su Invite, she suddenly rushed forward in confusion and helplessly wrapped around her waist, leaning against her arms. Everyone was stunned. This intimate gesture, even if Su Invited was sick, had never been used on Mrs. He. At first, Mrs. He was a bit uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy, but she quickly realized it. She reached out and grabbed Su Invite, stroking her soft hair, and even unconsciously lowered her voice, saying, "What's wrong?" "Grandmother, I'm not going to the capital anymore." Su Invited choked up and tears welled up in her eyelashes, as if she didn't want her tears to be seen. She buried her head in Mrs. He's arms and said these words for a long time. And he was holding a teacup in her hand, and when she thought about what Granny He had just come for, she gave Su Sun a skeptical glance. Isn't it foolish, this child? Her home is in the capital city, and after raising her with the He family for a few years, it can be seen that the Su family has looked down upon and hesitated about her. Finally, the Su family let her go back, but she still didn't go back. Does she want to stay in her grandfather's house without proper name or words? What does that look like? Mrs. He didn't expect that Su Invited to speak with these words. Her face immediately darkened and she scolded, "What nonsense. That's your home, and your parents are waiting for you at home. Why don't you say you're not going? Su invited her to hold her tighter, but the tears in her eyes seemed endless. Mrs. He noticed her tears and was immediately taken aback. She glanced at Grandma Huang, who knowingly asked all the servants in the room to leave. Mrs. He then reached out and pushed Su Sun away, looking at her seriously and asking, "What's going on?" "Well done, how could you say such a messy thing?" "I've heard Pearl say that the Shen family has come knocking," Su invited, covering her face. "The day Sang Mama came from the capital, she warned me. Since returning to the He family, I have had no further connection with the Shen family. I will forget all about the past 9 years." The girl's voice was full of pain. "But my grandmother, I can't betray my promise. I have been with the Shen family for 9 years, and they have not mistreated me." Mrs. He's eyebrows and eyes were tinged with anger. What kind of people are sent from the capital? Why did such a thing come to Su's invitation? She certainly knows what kind of personality her daughter is. She won't want anything that others have used, even if it's her biological daughter who hasn't grown up by her side, hasn't seen her before, and even called someone else's mother for 9 years. How could she not respond in her heart? In such a situation, it is even more impossible for Su Invite to have contact with the people of the Shen family. So the Shen family came knocking, and Mrs. He had no intention of letting Su Invite know. But unfortunately, the person Su invited to know is Pearl, and he also had a complicated expression. She moved her lips and inexplicably felt sorry for Su Invite. "I don't know, that's all." "I know." As Su Wen said, past relationships are not fake, but how can anyone who has a heart and a heart be indifferent? It seems that everything is Su Invited's fault. The crying of Su Sun was always weak. Over the years, in order to satisfy the Su family, she tirelessly studied the various rules and etiquette of the Bo family, memorized the relationships between various families and ethnic groups, and never indulged herself. Mrs. He felt heartbroken when she heard it in her heart. She touched her head and whispered a few words of advice before asking her, "Where's Grandma Sang?" "I don't know," Su Xing shook her head with tears in her eyes. "Grandmother, Grandma Sang said that she will handle this matter for me. I can't go see the Shen family, nor can I bring this up to you. But I'm extremely scared. Grandmother, besides you, I don't know who to ask or what to do. She is just such a trustworthy person." And he couldn't help but be moved. Su Invited's attachment to Mrs. He was not fake, she could tell. Mrs. He could see even more that she was being unconditionally trusted by others, a feeling she had not experienced for a long time. She comforted Su Invite and asked them to take him to the Bai Sha kitchen to clean and rest. In the blink of an eye, she coldly instructed Huang Mama, "Go and see where Sang Mama is now." She was so overindulged that she didn't know where the sky and earth were. What does she think this place is? The Su family. So what? On whose territory, we have to abide by whose rules? Huang Mama silently glanced in the direction where Su invited her to leave, quickly agreed, and thoughtfully left the door, ordering people outside to inquire. Has the cousin changed her gender? She is usually a person who does not seek merit but seeks nothing wrong. After coming to this mansion for so many years, Huang Mama looked at her coldly and found that she had never really made any requests on her own. Even things like servants' unhappiness and dim sum's unsavory taste never came out. This kind of tolerant girl suddenly came to complain, this is not her style. And he frowned even more and said, "What's wrong with this servant? He doesn't know how to behave. This kind of thing is the responsibility of the masters. How dare they secretly reveal it to Yao Yao? What are you trying to do? What are you doing?" Mrs. He's eyes and eyebrows, like those of a bodhisattva, moved and she let out a soft breath, saying, "What else can it be? I have deceived you." She had already noticed before that Sang Mama and Pearl were acting too presumptuously and didn't take Su Sun seriously. Otherwise, how could Zhu Xin become even more dull since they arrived, wishing that every step she took would be measured with a ruler to see if it was the standard. She didn't intervene before because she knew that Su Wensheng was sensitive and afraid that going over her to deal with her servants would make her feel even more uneasy. Moreover, there were only a few people sent from the capital, and she was too lazy to argue with them. But now, they have crossed the line. I said I forgot to do something, but actually forgot to post. Since getting a low grade A, I feel that my IQ has also decreased. I apologize to everyone. Also, I'm bowing down to ask for a recommendation and collection, and everyone is too indifferent. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Black Form. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Black Form. After seeing the Shen family and his wife, Grandma Sang returned to the He family with a happy mood. She was familiar with the way and walked into the courtyard where Su invited her. Thinking about the cautious demeanor of the Shen family and their companions, she couldn't help but let out a click in her heart. No wonder such a timid merchant's family raised Su inviting so timid and cowardly. But that's just right. If it weren't for their incompetence, her job wouldn't have gone so smoothly. She walked from the corridor to the side room to the east, sat down in her room facing the best, had a sip of tea, and leisurely slid the bracelet out of her sleeve, exhaling slowly. Fool, where can you see such a good-looking thing outside? Even if you were holding the money and didn't have space to buy it, Su invited you to raise your hand and give it away. She didn't even think about what it meant that this bracelet was so valuable and personally given by the third wife. Once you know it was sent out to see your foster parents, TSK Grandma Sang couldn't help feeling a little pitiful in her heart for the true daughter she had picked up from outside. She is so foolish and incompetent. If her identity is not discovered and she can safely raise a married person at the merchant's house, it would be her lucky fate. Unfortunately, she was found back. In the eyes of Miss San, with such a small trick, she may not even need to take action. In the blink of an eye, she will fly into ashes. When she saw the Shen couple outside, she took a few sips of wine and looked at the precious jade bracelet. She felt overjoyed and was about to put it away when she heard a knock on the door. Unconsciously, she withdrew her hand into her sleeve and quickly agreed to stand up and open the door. Seeing Huang Mama, Sang Mama's face was filled with laughter. They are also old acquaintances. Sang Mama was the third wife's dowager, and when she was young, she also worked as a maid in the He family. In terms of seniority, it's just that she's not as senior as Huang Mama. She naturally pulled Grandma Huang into the room and said, "It's cold outside. Sister, come in and have a cup of tea. Is there anything worth visiting yourself?" Huang Mama's face remained as friendly and amiable as ever, waving her hand and laughing, "Next time, it's not time for tea. Madam, please come over." "Madam." Sang Mama's face showed confusion, but her heart was even more strange. Mrs. He didn't care about everything and was all focused on chanting Buddhism. If it weren't for Su inviting's illness this time, she wouldn't even be able to leave the room. Why did she suddenly have to see a housekeeper? She was puzzled and coughed before politely asking Huang Mama why. Perhaps it was for the purpose of returning to Beijing. Huang Mama didn't take it seriously, her attitude was ordinary, and there was no sign of anything wrong on her face. Sang Mama also felt relieved. That's right, there's nothing else besides this possibility. She didn't think at all about the Shen couple. In her opinion, even if Su invited that kind of person and gave her 100 courage, it was impossible to reveal anything about the Shen couple. As for the other people in this courtyard, Yen Chao and the others had no way of knowing. They all had the same tongue as her, and no one would say anything. Since it's not because of this, there's nothing to be afraid of. Grandma Sang calmly closed the door, reached out and patted her flushed face, and followed Grandma Huang to Mrs. He's yard. In the early winter, there were 2 huge wudong trees around the Taiyan courtyard. When the wind blew, the yellowed leaves whirled down in the air, and soon a layer of golden carpet was paved for the Taiyan courtyard. Grandma Sang stepped on these fallen leaves and walked into the courtyard. She saw the little girls cleaning up the fallen leaves in the courtyard, and there were several pots of evening chrysanthemums under the corridor. The whole courtyard was golden when illuminated by the sunset. The big girl Chuntao personally greeted Huang Mama and hung the curtains for them, saying, "Madam is waiting inside." Grandma Sang became even more relaxed, smiling and nodding at Chuntao. Mrs. He was talking to Aunt He, and Huang Mama stepped forward to report that Sang Mama had arrived. She then nodded and casually pointed to a small stool not far away, asking Sang Mama to sit down. Grandma Sang was flattered and quickly apologized, saying she didn't dare. Mrs. He didn't let her go either. She just glanced at her and asked lightly, "You didn't wait with Yao before, where did you go?" Unexpectedly, Mrs. He opened her mouth and asked this question. Grandma Sang was a bit puzzled, but after a while, she realized and quickly said, "The girl instructed me to go out and do something for her, so I didn't follow her." And he looked down at her calmly, with a hint of sarcasm in her eyes. "What's up?" Mrs. He let out a sigh and raised her eyebrows meaningfully, asking, "What's up?" She's been raised in a deep boudoir and hasn't been out since she came to the He family. Is there anything you need to do outside? Is there something that's not done well in our mansion? This question is very insightful. Sang Mama has been immersed in the uncle's mansion for many years, and her alertness has heightened. My wife specifically came to ask about her going out. Do you know who she went to see? Otherwise, how could you ask such a question? She is a servant, even if the master doesn't go out and doesn't ask, is it worth asking if she goes out on her own? Thinking of this, she let out a thump in her heart. Do you know she went to see the Shen couple? This is not impossible either. After all, the Shen couple first submitted a post to the He family, and the He family may have sent someone to watch the Shen couple. Sang Mama felt a bit regretful in her heart. She shouldn't have been so impatient. She should have secretly chosen a suitable time to deliver a letter to the Shen family and his wife. Then, Su invited her to request to go out and meet with the Shen family. This way, the He family would have discovered the best effect. Now the people of the He family have noticed in advance that Su inviting has not yet met the Shen couple, let alone the scenes of crying and complaining about grievances or crying in pain, which is not good. Grandma Sang's mind turned rapidly and she made a decision at once, seeming both embarrassed and hesitant. She bit her lip and knelt down on the ground. Mrs. He looked at her expressionlessly and said, "Speak well, why are you kneeling?" Sang Mama hesitated and lay trembling on the ground, seeming extremely afraid. "Madam, I went out today, but in fact I took the girl's order to meet her foster parents." After she finished speaking, she felt the whole room suddenly quiet down, so much so that she could hear the faint laughter of the little girls outside. But her heart suddenly relaxed. See, this is indeed an abscess that cannot be punctured or moved, it will rot and bleed with just one movement. Su invited, if she gets a little bit of it, her whole body will rot and stink, and she won't be able to get rid of it anymore. Her mother is someone who can't handle sand in her eyes, destined to not accept a biological daughter who yearns for her adoptive parents. Here's an update. After refreshing, I still lost a collection. What's going on? Laughing and crying. Continuing to seek collections and recommendations. If everything goes smoothly, you may be able to change your status this afternoon. Please support me a lot, Maeda. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Zhu Xin. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Zhu Xin, who told me so much about the Shen family's arrival in Taiyuan. Mrs. He's voice seemed to be shrouded in a layer of mist, drifting lightly. How could she know? Sang Mama's body trembled with a chill as she blurted out her already prepared plan in her heart. "Miss, she has always been as meticulous as dust and has always been concerned about her adoptive parents. A while ago, someone from the capital came to give gifts, which may have been a slip of the tongue. Since then, the girl's mind has been heavy, to the point of falling ill. The He family has been raising Su Invite for several years and has been devoted to her. Despite this, Su Invite still cares so much about her foster parents and seizes every opportunity to pay attention to their affairs. The He family is the mother's family of the third wife. Can you be happy with Su Invite's behavior? If the He family is unhappy and Mrs. He is unhappy, they will naturally wait for Su's invitation and tell the Su family in the capital about it. After the words of the He family, this matter is truly confirmed. Before Su Inviting entered the capital, she first made the people of the Su family feel that she had been taken care of by a merchant and was no longer familiar with them. And he had a gloomy expression as she looked at Grandma Sang with a somewhat complicated expression. Is it really just a slave bullying the master? Mrs. He let out a chuckle and asked her with mixed joy and anger, so, what else should you say to the Shin couple while letting you go out? Sang Mama observed her words and expressions carefully and said, Miss, I wanted to meet them. Originally, Miss was planning to go today, but I don't think it's good. Since we haven't gone through the elders, and the Shin family is not a guest of our family, how can we meet privately? After persuading Miss repeatedly, she agreed to let me go out and send a letter to the Shin family first, arrange a time to see them, so that we can reunite. A family reunion. Mrs. He couldn't help but laugh. Murder slays the heart, this Sang Mama really doesn't seem like a slave. If these words were spoken before Su Invited came, how would they view Su Invited? I thought she was just greedy for some benefits, hoping to use the affairs of the Shin family to threaten Su Invite and gain some benefits from Su Invite. Su Invite has a good temper and is easy to handle, which is well known. However, now it seems that Sang Mama's intentions are far more than expected. Mrs. He hasn't been angry for many years. She has been with Qingdang ancient Buddha for so many years, and even she has forgotten what she was originally like. Sang Mama rarely made her angry, so she squinted her eyes and glanced at Sang Mama. She lightly put down her tea bowl and said, Is that so? You can't be such a master either. Before Grandma Sang could react, Mrs. He's face suddenly darkened and she said, What's on your wrist? Grandma Sang was surprised. She drank too much today and was in a hurry before coming. She didn't expect to hide this thing, so she instinctively lifted her wrist to cover it up. I can't hide it anymore. And he slowly stretched out her hand, revealing a bracelet exactly like that on Mammy Sang's wrist. She frowned in disgust. You are really bold. What is it that you deserve? This was the dowry of their sisters when they got married. It was something left by their grandmother. And he and Mrs. Su had one, and Mrs. Su invited her, which was known to all. But now, this bracelet is in the hands of Grandma Sang. If Su Inviting were a reckless person, it would be fine. But how much she yearns for returning to the Su family and how hard she works, everyone can see it. How could she possibly give something to a servant from Mrs. Su San? Since it was not invited by Su, it goes without saying how the bracelet got into Grandma Sang's hands. Mrs. He's eyes were about to burst into flames, and after a while, she gave a cold smile. Sang Mama was so amused that her liver and gallbladder were splitting. It wasn't until then that she realized something was wrong. She was covered in a cold sweat from her back, and her whole body was completely awake. The hint of alcohol had long disappeared without a trace. She didn't care to ponder her doubts in her heart, but quickly kowtowed to Mrs. He and Aunt He, saying, Madam, Aunt, this bracelet was given by the girl. I didn't dare to ask for it, but the girl insisted on giving it. She couldn't continue, and the cold light in Mrs. He's eyes almost condensed into substance. Then Mrs. He patted her hands lightly, and Huang Mama, who was already prepared, shouted towards the outside. A few sturdy women rushed in and pressed Sang Mama to the ground, blocking her mouth tightly. Keep it down. Mrs. He didn't even move her eyebrows and eyes, and then said, Let the eldest wife come over. Grandma Sang widened her eyes and only now did she realize something was wrong. It's this bracelet. This bracelet weighed more than her life, and she wouldn't even take it off to sleep. At that time, she only felt that Su was sick and confused, and was attracted by the value of this bracelet, to the extent that she forgot how Su was alone. Yeah, how could Su, who is so cowardly and incompetent, take the initiative to mention meeting the Shen couple? Sang Mama's heart lit up with a flash of inspiration, and her blood all over her body froze in an instant. She was deceived by Su's invitation. After so many years of smooth sailing, she unexpectedly fell for Su's invitation at this time. But she could no longer defend herself, and the rough women fiercely dragged her out. She didn't even have a chance to struggle, only had time to see the cold light on Mrs. He's face. When Grandma He arrived, Mrs. He had already returned to her usual kind and peaceful demeanor. When she arrived, she calmly asked her to sit down and asked her, did the second wife of the Shen family clarify everything? What did she say? Grandma He was somewhat surprised. She didn't expect Mrs. He to personally inquire about this matter, but she quickly realized and carefully told Mrs. He, Uncle Air has already inquired about it. The Shen family and his wife have encountered some trouble. They are in business, but since Yao Yao left, their business has been suppressed one after another, making it difficult for them to even establish themselves in the local area. They have been to the capital, but it is not of much use. Therefore, when they heard about Yao Yao's situation, they came to their door. Mrs. He raised her eyebrows and looked up at Grandma He, saying, suppress it. Grandma He's words were tactful, but it's not difficult for Mrs. He to guess the profound meaning behind her words. Otherwise, why did the Shen couple travel thousands of miles to the capital? Is it the Su family who suppressed the Shen family? The Su family was really successful. They found their own biological daughter, but couldn't bear to part with the Shen family's biological daughter. They simply closed their eyes and suppressed the Shen family all the way to the end, she sneered. Grandma He didn't want to offend her sister in law, so she smiled and said, Uncle's mansion is deeply rooted and lush with leaves. It's possible that the people below are trying to guess the intentions of their superiors and have done something wrong. The Shen family and his wife found this place, but they had no choice but to come. I heard from Uncle Air that they even borrowed money for the hotel, fearing it would be a disaster. They made up their minds to come. Here's an update again. As soon as I change my status, I receive a reward. I am very happy and honored, and I will continue to work hard. Also, in the new book, I would like to recommend the new book EP1-10 by Zhu Xin. Those who are interested can take a look. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Disposal. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Disposal. Mrs. He snorted and had a big opinion about her daughter's confusion in her heart. She was really stupid. The incident at the beginning has been confirmed to be an accidental mistake. Since that's the case, it's up to everyone, but she insisted on leaving the fake one by her side. If one's reputation is not right and one's heart is not aligned, it is easy for life to have inappropriate thoughts. Fake ones like pearls and treasures of love carried by their side, but truly they have been left to be raised by them for several years. Judging from what she sent, you can tell how careless her attitude towards Su's invitation was. That's all for now. Surprisingly, they still have trouble finding their foster parents. She didn't say anything more about this topic and instructed Grandma He, please bring the Shen couple home, just say I invited them to come over as guests. Grandma He was somewhat surprised. She thought Mrs. He must cover up for Mrs. Su San and sent the Shen family from afar, but Mrs. He actually invited the Shen family to come to her door. The people from the Shen family have arrived, can they still hide the invitation from Su? What is Mrs. He planning to do? She hesitated and said, Mother. There's one more thing. Mrs. He raised her hand and interrupted her, saying in a deep voice, Sister Sang next to Yao has committed a crime. Go investigate and see how many things she still has that she doesn't care about. The people in her yard, if they can be used, keep them. If they can't, send them out. I know you're kind and afraid of causing trouble, but not everyone in the He family takes care of them. Grandma He only realized at this moment that something she didn't know had happened, and was momentarily puzzled. Who didn't know that Sang Mama was sent by Mrs. Su San, and she spoke confidently in Su Invite's yard. Even Su Invite was very obedient to her. Grandma He was in charge of the affairs of the He family, but due to the subtle psychology that more things are better than less, even if she saw that Sang Mama had crossed some boundaries, she never thought about taking care of it. Mrs. He didn't just give up because of Grandma Sang's identity back then. But today, how did the sun come out from the west? She quickly stood up and hung her head on one side, immediately saying, "Mom, is it mine?" "There's nothing wrong with you," Mrs. He pursed her lips and smiled. "Being a mother is like this. Do you still expect your aunt to stand up for a niece?" This statement was too harsh, it was a bit heart-wrenching. Grandma He was taken aback and immediately felt a burning sensation on her face, so she knelt down in front of Mrs. He. "In recent years, my mother-in-law has remained silent. Although she has taken good care of Su Invite, it is also limited, at least not to the point where her sister-in-law feels that besides satisfying Su Invite's daily life, she also needs guidance." They originally thought they had identified Mrs. He's pulse, but it turned out that Mrs. He had seen them all and had a deep understanding of their thoughts. "Before, I didn't say it, I was afraid I felt it was unnecessary to say it, but what happened to ignite this lead that shouldn't have been ignited?" At this point, and he became the one in the middle who tried to smooth things out. She let out a sigh and helped Grandma He up, then said to Grandma He, "Sister-in-law, don't take it amiss. Mom has been infuriated by Grandma Sang, and she is angry and can say some angry words." She said, and as soon as she mentioned what Grandma Sang did, she sighed and said, "Let's forget about anything else, but this servant is deceiving us and has the ability to do such things. If we don't come to Mom's place, wouldn't we have suffered a big loss? She lured us out to meet the Shen family in private. What do others think when it's time? She actually wants to ruin Yao Yao. Who gave her the courage? No wonder she gets angry when such a person is placed next to Yao Yao." Grandma He was stunned. She thought that Sang Mama must have made a mistake, but she didn't expect Sang Mama to have this idea and secretly deceive Su into inviting out to meet the Shen family. That Grandma He finally knows why Mrs. He is so angry. No, Grandma Sang said it was someone sent by Mrs. Su San, but this was definitely not something Mrs. Su San instructed her to do. Unless Mrs. Su San was crazy and foolish, how could she let the servant deceive her own daughter into meeting her foster parents? So, Sang Mama is the one who betrayed Su San's wife and did not invite Su to be the master. Sang Mama suddenly designed Mrs. He's daughter and granddaughter, hoping to make Mrs. Su San and Su invite her mother and daughter to separate. Even if Mrs. He is a mud bodhisattva, she may have to get up and fall to Sang Mama's death first. Besides, Mrs. He has never been easy to deal with. She also thought of something even more important. Was it really just because she was afraid that Su invited to Taiyan Hospital to cry? If it's just a repayment, if it's not the scheming of Su's invitation was too terrifying. After several years of forbearance, she showed weakness to the enemy, making everyone feel that she was cowardly and deceitful. She was naturally placed in the position of a victim, and then endured until now, suddenly breaking out at the most appropriate time. Kill with one strike. Clean and neat. Grandma He almost wanted to clap her hands and praise, except for her hair standing on end. At the same time, Grandma He, who was packing for Grandpa He, also heard the news. Upon hearing this news, she looked up from a pile of lists and asked with uncertainty, who was kicked out. Wang skillfully arranged the neatly arranged things for her and heard the Bauhinia say, "It's Sang Mama. Sang Mama next to cousin has been taken away, causing a lot of commotion. My wife even called for grandmother." Wang's movement suddenly stopped, and her face showed an incredulous expression similar to Grandma He's, saying, "Can't it?" She walked up to Grandma He and asked Grandma He's question, isn't it all about Grandma Sang's words in Miss Biao's room? What did she do to make such a scene? Zijing shook her head and said, I heard that the cousin first went to the wife's room and seemed to be crying. Soon after, there was news that the wife called her Granny Fa Luosang Mama. Grandma he became even more confused after listening. Cry. Will Su invite still cry? She thought this young lady was just a face person. To be honest, after all these years of coming to our house, she couldn't even figure out Su's personality. This person was so indifferent that she didn't even talk much. She even ran to her wife and cried. She has never caused anything wrong before. Even Wang gave a strange click and said, this is really strange. Our cousin is very cautious in her words and actions. Even though she knew that my wife's second aunt was there today, she even went to cry. If something goes wrong, there will always be demons. Sang Mama is such a first-class intimacy in front of Su invite. How much taboo would she have to make before her wife would disregard the face of her aunt in the capital and directly masturbate someone? She glanced at Grandma He and said, Grandma He, you also need to have a clear understanding of this matter. Ye still has to send Su to invite him to the capital. Of course, he needs to figure out all these things and have a clear understanding. Thank you very much for the bread and rice, as well as the peace talisman for subduing demons and demons. Bao, Maeda, end of this chapter. Chapter 9. Weakness. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Weakness. When Su invited Yen Chao back to her yard, Chi Mama, the steward mother next to Grandma He, was coming out of Grandma Sang's room with a book. When she saw her, she quickly stood up and greeted her with a spring breeze. They weren't so enthusiastic before. Yen Chao glanced at Su invite. Su invited, still looking very friendly from the past, whispered to his mother and thanked her, Thank you very much, Mom. Is there any misunderstanding? Chi's mother let out a sigh in her heart. Thinking of her grandmother's words, she didn't dare to really treat this seemingly harmless young lady as a little white rabbit. She quickly said, Miss, you have a kind heart. This old man has lived no worse than his grandmother's because of your favor. Let's forget about the many things you found in her room. She even decorated her room outside with grandeur. Su Sun sighed and pursed his lips, seeming somewhat disappointed. Finally, he didn't say anything and walked up the stairs into the room. Chi's mother noticed that she didn't even glance at the book, indicating that she had a clear idea. This watch girl. As soon as he entered the room, Yen Chao was both surprised and delighted. He called out to the girl, and his eyes immediately turned red. This is just the beginning, there are still many such scenes to watch. She can't just settle for the suffering she suffered back then. Everything that the Su family gave her has been engraved in her bones. She did not beg them to pick her up and restore her identity. If they treat this as not happening and she grows up in the Shin family without knowing anything, perhaps she will be even happier. But they are too greedy. They don't want their flesh and blood to be left with someone else's name, and they also can't bear to let their fake daughter, who has been raised for many years, indulge her in lawlessness. Both of them were unable to position themselves properly, so naturally they both felt wronged. Su Xingxuan always thought she was the most pitiful person in her previous life. It's really ridiculous. If Su Xingxuan feels wronged, then what is Su inviting? If you don't know for a lifetime, it's just hopeless. But when they brought her back, they ignored her and treated her as a sacrifice everywhere. This feeling is like a candy that originally belonged to you has been snatched away. You have tasted it first and can't quit it, but as you know in your heart, this candy will eventually not reach your mouth. She has been repeatedly tortured, sacrificed, and utilized for a lifetime, and in this lifetime, she will always have to take a different path. And all of this should start before she enters Beijing. God is kind to her, allowing her to be reborn at this moment. Everything has not started yet, everything has not happened yet, and everything she needs to do is still in time. Excluding Grandma Sang, this is just the first step. Xiu Yu had the softest temperament among several people, and she was the first to suffer. Not long after arriving in the capital, Xiu Yu was punished by Sang Mama for wanting to send out the news that the Su family had forced her to fill the pit for Suan. Sang Mama assigned her to a stable servant, and later Su invited her to find out that Xiu Yu died in childbirth in the second year of her marriage. She later came to a complete understanding that sometimes so-called blood ties are not as good as the servants around her who spend time together. After a moment of confusion, the door suddenly creaked and was knocked open. A Pearl, like a young lady, with her hair draped around her hair, rushed in and rushed toward Su Sun, feeling helpless. With a loud cry, she burst into tears. Su invited to squint her eyes gently. Pearl had already grabbed onto her hem, crying uncontrollably. "Girl! What did you say to your wife? My mother was taken away by her grandmother. She treated you with all her heart and lungs, treating you like a biological daughter. In the capital, it was also my mother who helped to smooth things out. If you don't have my mother, how can you get close to your wife when you go back?" Her eyes were red, and it was rare for her to feel a little embarrassed in front of Su Invite. She couldn't figure out why she could make such a scene in just one day. Her mother had a face, and she was rarely criticized by the masters of the He family. Why was she suddenly tied up and searched for? Su invited to sit in a chair and gaze down at her. The face in front of her, which was full of pear blossoms and rain, gradually overlapped with Aunt Sang's previous life. After marrying into the Qing family, she still relied on pearls, and even after she fell into the water and was saved by Qing Dingyan, she took the initiative to give her a title and lift her to become an aunt. But Pearl turned around and bit her in the end, becoming a knife that Qing Dingyan chopped at her. People like this used to have emotions when they were young. She looked at the Pearl without much emotion, but her tone was completely soft and gentle. "I have no choice. My grandmother called me over and said, Sang Mama went to see her parents privately." She looked up at her with a hazy expression, but Pearl suddenly stared at her and gritted her teeth, saying, "Girl. That was my mother who only went to inquire at your command. How could you watch my mother be punished for this reason? Who dares to do things for you in the future if you do this? At such a young age, even if I try my best to cover it up, my unwillingness is just about to be covered up." Su Qin pursed his lips and timidly withdrew, waving his hand and shaking his head vigorously, saying, "I can't do it. My grandmother wants to do this." Pearl almost vomited a mouthful of blood. "I had known that Su Inviting was unreliable, but I didn't expect her to be useless like this." Her eyes turned red and she stared at Su Inviting for a moment, unsure of how to handle it. Su Invited, however, seemed to have remembered something and hurriedly pulled out some jewelry from the makeup box to give to her, saying, "You can take this and clear the way for Grandma. When something happens, I only know how to use these things to block people's mouths, and I won't think of any way. If it weren't for the current incident with my mother, Pearl would have wished to write a letter back to invite credit and let the capital see her foolishness." She let out a breath of hatred, enduring it again and again, in order to control herself from speaking ill at Su Invite. She picked up the jewelry like a gust of wind and rolled it out of the room. As soon as she left, Su Invited was too lazy to act anymore and closed her makeup box with a snap, leaving her face expressionless for an instant. Xiu Yu was already startled. She glanced at Yen Chao and felt as if she was dreaming. The girl is really different from before. She asked Pearl to find someone to mediate, and at this critical moment, whoever Pearl went to mediate was just adding fuel to the fire. After a moment of silence in the room, Xiu Yu finally called out to the girl and hesitated, saying, "You." Among the few maids, Xiu Yu was the softest but also the most attentive. She had always felt that Pearl was too careless in serving Su Invite, but Sang Mama controlled the affairs of the yard, and they didn't believe anything Su Invite said. "Thank you very much for Pingyue's icy fall also, if you pass by, please ask for a collection. Is it really written so poorly?" End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Adoptive Mother. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Adoptive mother Zhu Xin's performance was very plain, as if it was not a big deal. They are too ambitious, keeping them is just causing trouble. It's better to do something for me. Consider it as the reward for sucking on her blood for the past few years. But then he couldn't help but feel a little worried. But what will happen in the capital if the girl loses Sang Mama? They all know that Zhu invited to trust Sang Mama and her daughter mostly because of their relationship with the capital, and also because of their respect for Mrs. Zhu. I was about to return to Beijing now, but suddenly I sent the mother and daughter away. Even those close to them know that it's because Sang Mama and her daughter went too far and had bad intentions, but they don't know about it in the capital. They are servants of the He family again, and even when they go to the capital, they can't speak. Over the years, they have been serving in front of Zhu Invite, listening to Grandma Sang's daily conversations, and also knowing that Mrs. Zhu San is very caring and doting on her adopted daughter. On the contrary, the girls were biological, but they leaned back and only brought some clothes and jewelry during festivals. Even so, these things don't fit well. It can be seen that Mrs. Zhu San didn't actually take Zhu Inviting too seriously. Zhu Inviting sent Sister Sang and her daughter away, and it's unclear whether they will be reprimanded when they return to the capital. Zhu Invited, knowing what they were worried about, smiled nonchalantly and said, "Don't take action now. After returning to the capital, you will be constrained everywhere. It's okay, I have a clear idea." Zhu En and Zhu Xingxuan were favored by the Zhu family. When she returned to the capital, there were still many things to do. If she still followed the people who were in the Chao camp and in the Han, everything would be troublesome. It was better to solve it before entering the capital, which was also a big gift she gave them in advance. She paused slightly as she thought of this and turned her head to ask Yan Chao, "Where's Shen Mama?" A few girls all widened their eyes. When Zhu invited someone from the Shen family to come to the He family, there was no one around him, except for Shen's mother, who was her wet nurse, who followed along. But after Sang Mama came from the capital, she picked out many flaws with Shen Mama, constantly knocking on Zhu Inviting, and both inside and outside, pointing out that Shen Mama couldn't stand the stage. After going to the capital, she would be disliked by Mrs. Zhu San. Zhu Invited had no choice but to have Grandma Sang arrange for Shen's mother to be transferred away. Now Zhu invites to ask Shen Mama again, is it planning to continue using Shen Mama? To be fair, compared to the arrogant and difficult to get along with Sang Mama, the maids do prefer the gentle Shen Mama. Yan Chao calmed down before speaking, "Shen Mama is outside the washing room, what do you mean? Go tell Huang Mama that since so many people have gone out, I naturally need suitable people around me to make up for it. Let's invite Shen Mama back," Zhu invited, thinking of Shen Mama, with a hint of genuine joy in her eyes. In her previous life, she was timid and afraid of things, thinking that just giving in would bring about so-called familial affection, but she put aside these truly caring and righteous people. Let's do it again, whoever is good to her will naturally be good to her. As for what she couldn't get, she didn't want it long ago. Speaking of Huang Mama, a little girl outside cautiously knocked on the door and reported that Huang Mama had arrived. Zhu invited her to nod and personally welcome her out. She saw Huang Mama smiling and leading a little maid named Zhu Yi from Mrs. He's yard over. When she saw her, she smiled first and said, "Miss Biao, there's a guest from Mrs. He's place. Let's change your clothes and come over to see her." Guests at this time Mrs. He sat on the com, leaning against a cushion. And he still sat with Mrs. He, and when Zhu invited her in, she smiled and asked her, "Yao Yao, let's see who's here. Go and meet her quickly. Years have passed since we last met." Before Zhu Xing could even lift her head, Mrs. Shen sobbed and shouted, "Yao Yao." She quickly stood up and took a few steps to grab Zhu Xing's hand, tears streaming down her back. The tears carried a scorching warmth, almost making Zhu Invite gasp for breath. In the previous life, she was abandoned by Qing Dingyan. The third wife of the Su family despised her as a concubine and left her on the estate, ignoring her. The Xin family tried every possible way to reconcile their relationship and visit her on the estate, buying the estate to buy her things. At that time, the Xin family and his wife were already very difficult. Suan intervened to suppress the Xin family in order to prevent Su Xingxuan from being known as a merchant woman. The Xin family had to sell their ancestral home to seek refuge with Mrs. Xin's mother's family in the capital. But the Xin couple still misses her. Swan always likes to argue that the Xin family and his wife are businessmen, and when she mentions her younger sister, she always sneers and says that she is covered in the smell of copper. But in fact, she, who was raised by the Xin family, did not harm anyone. Su Xingxuan, who grew up in the uncle's mansion and was supported by Jin Chunyu, only knew how to climb up by stepping on the flesh and blood of others. Mrs. Shen lost her composure and, thinking of her husband's repeated reminders, changed her tone with some nervousness. She called out to Su to invite Miss Su, with a cautious tone and attitude. The appearance of the He family coming to accept Su's invitation, as well as the difficulty of wanting to meet Su's invitation now, have already made Mrs. Shen understand the significant difference in identities between the two sides. She let go of her grip on Su's invitation and anxiously rubbed against her dress, explaining in confusion, "We just wanted to come and see you." Su invited her to hold her hand in the opposite direction, openly and without any concealment. In front of Mrs. He and Aunt He, she spoke in a gentle but firm tone, "Don't be so divided. I was raised by you, and you have nurtured me. No matter where I go or what my identity is, this will not change. My grandmother and aunt are very kind and reasonable people, and they both understand." Mrs. He's expression moved slightly. Aunt He also showed complexity on her face. Mrs. Shen's tears flowed even more urgently. She had been facing consecutive setbacks in the capital for several years, and her family's business was deteriorating. She was not unaware of any tricks in between. They also tried their best to meet Su Xingxuan once, but that girl stood tall and felt like her eyes were dirty when she saw them. Since then, their semicolon in the capital has been even worse. Mrs. Shen never expected that Su, the true daughter of the uncle's mansion, would still openly say that she remembered their nurturing kindness. "Thank you for the half-month reward. I'm really sorry today. The baby has been vomiting and diarrhea for 2 days and has been hospitalized for gastroenteritis. I couldn't come back to update midway, so it was a long time late. I'm sorry everyone." End of this chapter.